Thank you very much, Ehsan, for this very kind words of introduction. May I take this opportunity to wish everybody peace. I think that in Arabic discourse and Islamic discourse, it is important to remember that the notion of peace also embodies security, and the notion of security also embodies good health. So please stay in good health. Let me try to deal with the questions you have posed for me by first raising some aspects of the world economy and particularly the national economy, which were hugely problematic to begin with, before looking at the specific impacts of COVID-19. As you correctly pointed out, criticisms of the economic system were very much already very widespread and in many parts of the world. And I think there were very specific nature of the criticisms in this part of the world. Let me first emphasize that I think there has been a growing appreciation that our economic system, our way of life, in fact, is really unsustainable. It is unsustainable for a variety of reasons, which are have been much discussed, not only for ecological and environmental reasons, or questions of resource exhaustion, resource availability, but also because in many ways we are generating in economic life, especially, we are generating a great number of problems for ourselves. These problems are often assigned by conventional economists as so-called externalities, as negative externalities, which often means that they don't really figure very much in the analysis. So there is a huge problem, not only with the economy, but also with economics. Economics' general failure to try to come to grips with this problem. Now, one issue which has become much more significant in recent times is the resurgence of inequality. I think it is important to acknowledge that in most economies of the world, we have seen a significant increase in inequality, especially in the last couple of decades, if not more. But at the global level, partly because of the rapid growth of economies such as China and India and some of the other countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as exceptional performance of countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and so on and so forth, we have seen some closing of the gap. Some people like to talk about it and exaggerate and claim that there's a new convergence happening. But I think there was some closing of the gap, which is important for us to acknowledge, to recognize. Now, having said that, I think it is important also to recognize that the fact that you may have growing inequalities at the national level doesn't necessarily mean that the international or global inequalities, in other words, inequalities between countries, was necessarily increasing. Of course, this is a very uneven process, and some economies were doing much, much better than other economies. And we have seen many others and many economies which were largely left behind. But because of the way in which many of these things are measured and how most people like to have a single unit measure of inequality, we end up with a situation which does not seem to suggest a tremendous growth in inequality. A third element which I think is important for us to recognize is the fact that that in many ways the economic system is dysfunctional. The very success of certain powerful economic interests has actually led to a great deal of dysfunctionality. Let me give you a couple of examples. We have seen the ascendance of what may be called finance. The ascendance of finance has been hugely problematic. We have seen private finance growing, or market finance growing to some extent at the expense of bank finance. But also we have seen the changing role of banks in the international system. And with the growth of market finance, we have seen what many people would call the financialization of the world economy. Process has been going on for the last few decades, since the end of the 20th century. And this financialization has often meant the subordination of real economic interests, if I can put it that way, to financial interests. So just to give you a couple of examples, once upon a time, General Electric used to be an electrical appliances company, or Enron used to be an energy company. But over time, the company's management changed, and with it, we have seen GE, for example, becoming a financial conglomerate with an electrical appliance focus. Or we saw Enron becoming a financial conglomerate with an energy focus. And all this basically implies many things. So we have seen, for example, in the last decade, particularly in the United States, following the financial crash of 2008, we have seen a great number of so-called share buybacks, where those who control companies have basically bought back their own shares. So the availability of cheap finance with the extraordinary or unconventional monetary policies which have been adopted in the West have not meant that there has been more finance available for economic growth. Instead, the more finance which has been made available has actually been available to concentrate power. So we have tremendous amount of greater concentration of power, particularly in some economies where finance has been basically allowed to run the show. This is just one example of the dysfunctionality of the system. There are other examples which we can consider later if time allows. The other issue which I think is important for us to recognize is that the interests of the people, meaning the people at large, is often not well served by this economic system. The elite, of course, generally benefits, not all the entire elite, but usually elites tend to benefit. But we also see a great number of people in the so-called middle class who have been able to take advantage of recent economic trends and who are reasonably comfortable and are not averse to what is happening. But the result has been that, but on the other hand, you have seen a great number of people experiencing declining living standards. And this has happened in many parts of the world, including, for example, in the United States. There you have seen, for example, a decline in real wages, which workers enjoy. But we have also seen a great deal of social dysfunctionality, well, for want of a better term, inappropriate behavior, the resorting to greater opioids, for example, and many so-called respectable families have become extremely rich from the production and sale of opioids in the United States, for example. And there are similar phenomena, the increasing use of all kinds of drugs in many other parts of the world. So all this poses huge problems for all of us. And accompanying a lot of this, of course, has been a growth of corruption. And much of this corruption is not necessarily corruption which is illegal, but you have the powerful interests able to modify laws so that much of what they do, which might be considered illicit, but not necessarily considered illegal. So the influence of power on lawmaking and changing laws in order to legitimize and extend power is something not to be underestimated. There's a recent book by a woman professor at Columbia called The Code of Capital, for example, which underscores the importance of property rights in terms of extending this. And if you think, for example, about how intellectual property rights have been created and promoted since the 1980s, and allows people to control power in ways which have become very, very socially dysfunctional, in ways which perhaps we can discuss later. Now, accompanying all this, of course, are new challenges, which I will come back to later. But let me just highlight those 4 elements to begin with, before considering what we mean by post-COVID-19. And post-COVID-19 can be understood in many different ways. I think it is useful for us to think of it in at least 3 different ways, because the implications of these 3 different phases, so to speak, are actually quite important and quite profound. First, I think it is important to recognize that the outbreak, the viral outbreak, has particular characteristics which distinguish it from many other previous viral outbreaks. In particular, I think it is important to recognize that this virus has been able to spread and infect much more easily than many other earlier viruses. And this is complicated by the fact that it is often difficult to confirm whether somebody has been infected, particularly during the first 5 days or so after infection. And so it's only after 5 days or so that the antigens begin to appear, and certain tests will be able to identify the antigens and confirm that somebody is COVID-19 positive. There are other tests which are cheaper and therefore more affordable in developing countries, which only confirm somebody is COVID-19 positive later when antibodies begin to emerge. And so there's a huge delay between the point of infection and infectiousness. The ability to transmit COVID-19 happens very, very quickly. And so we find that the outbreak grew very, very quickly, and many of these things we now know with the benefit of hindsight, but how much we have learned over the last 4.5 months or so. So if you think about what happened, even how COVID-19 spread is something which is quite contentious. A group of scientists at Cambridge University, for example, have argued that there are at least 3 different strains of COVID-19, A, B, and C. And the A strain is something which you find very much in North America, the B strain in China and other parts of the world, including our part of the world, in Southeast Asia. And the C strain has been very important, particularly in Southern Europe, in Italy and Spain and elsewhere. And these strains probably mutated from each other, but it appears that the B strain mutated from the A strain, and that the C strain probably mutated from the B strain. In other words, the history of this poses a number of questions. Now, many people, including quite respectable people, like conspiracy theories. The United States government is now actively arguing that China is behind the virus, and this claim has been taken up and echoed very vociferously by other influential powers, particularly Japan. But to a lesser extent, it has been taken up, for example, by the very influential Indian media or the media in Taiwan and in Australia and elsewhere. So that is a very powerful claim. There is a counterclaim by some in China. I won't say that it's official, and others who have been claiming that the virus actually originated in the United States in a military camp and was introduced into China from that camp. However, the scientists seem to agree that this probably was naturally occurring. How it occurred naturally is, again, a subject of great deal of contention, and I won't get into whether it came from bats or from other animals and so on and so forth. But the fact that it is yet another zoonotic virus, in other words, being transmitted from animal to human beings, is something of great concern. As I mentioned earlier, part of the reason why this virus is particularly infectious is because it is aerosol-borne. And really some contact with, particularly with the 3 facial orifices, the mouth, the nose, and the eyes, is enough for infection to take place. Now, there was a great deal of controversy, for example, over whether facial masks should be used. And now I think this matter has also thankfully been settled. But having said all that, what does that imply? And much more can be said, but I wanted to set this stage because there are a lot of myths going around about what this outbreak is about. And it is very important for us to recognize, for example, that there are at least two different ways in which countries have responded to the outbreak. Undoubtedly, in the case of Wuhan city and the 3 provinces around Wuhan city, the outbreak, when it was finally acknowledged after local authorities were reluctant to acknowledge, in fact, they even suppressed the so-called whistleblower. When it was acknowledged at the end of 2019 and reported to the WHO by the Wuhan authorities via Beijing, at that point, a number of actions were taken. The genome sequencing of the virus was reported by China within less than 2 weeks and shared with everybody who was interested. And so there was a great deal of cooperation and willingness to help right from the outset, contrary to many of the claims which are now going around. Now, whether there was suppressing of information at the end of last year, certainly in Wuhan, I think there is very little doubt now that the man who died was undoubtedly, participating. Undoubtedly, he was subjected to a great deal of personal hardship, and eventually he and the members of his family also died, paying a very, very high price for his bravery in telling the truth. But it appears that at least at the central level in Beijing and so on, there has been a willingness to cooperate, and the local authorities were chided for their initial response, and the rest, I think, we do know now. Now, all this is important because there's a great deal of mythology. So what happened in China is that in Wuhan and the surrounding provinces, there was undoubtedly a lockdown, because by that time, the outbreak had spread quite widely, and the Chinese authorities deemed that it was necessary to have a lockdown. However, it is also important to emphasize that in the rest of China, there was no lockdown. There were other early precautionary measures. And it's important for us to recognize that in East Asia and Kerala state in southwestern India, this was also the case. In all these places in East Asia, countries responded by taking precautionary measures, early and prompt action. And because these early and prompt actions were successful, South Korea, for example, which had a very serious problems, partly worsened by a religious cult which was meeting secretly in Daegu city in South Korea, there was a tremendous amount of spreading of infections due to this cult. But without having a lockdown, South Korea has been able to successfully cope with the problem. And they did so precisely by having early precautionary measures. I don't have time to go into those details, but I think it's very important to recognize that similar success was achieved in poorer economies, such as Vietnam and also in Kerala state. Okay, so I think it's very important for us to put it into perspective. The question of taking early action has been crucial, particularly in East Asia as well as in Kerala. Now, unfortunately, in much of the rest of the world, there was a certain sense of perhaps naivete, of complacency or whatever, and there was not early action, and action has basically been posed and been overly influenced by what has happened in the UK. In the UK, as you know, Imperial College London did a study, and they basically pointed out that the UK government's earlier approach of herd immunity would result in a high number of infections and deaths, over 1% of the population. And this basically forced the Johnson government to change its approach and to adopt instead a much more a different approach. By that time, of course, as we know, there was already recognition that the virus had spread. There were many, many people who were infected, and therefore a lockdown was also deemed necessary there, as well as in other places such as Italy and so on. Now, without going into any of those details, because the stories are very complicated and varied, I think it is important for us to recognize that as far as understanding what we mean by post-COVID changes, right? So you can say that everything has changed since the recognition of the COVID-19 outbreak. And undoubtedly, many things have changed. Even if you take early action, precautionary action, things change because of the requirements of physical distancing, the requirements of sanitary measures and other safe precautionary measures, such as wearing a face mask and so on and so forth. And the discouragement of people traveling together and so on and so forth, or people talking to each other, especially people who are not living together, talking to each other. So all this has undoubtedly changed how we interact with one another, and this has had a profound influence on life. So I think it's important to recognize that whether you took precautionary early action with some effects, undoubtedly, but particularly in terms of the requirement of physical distancing and other types of precautionary measures, that those things were very important, but they were less disruptive. Okay, they were less disruptive than some of the other measures which have been taken in association with lockdowns. So it's very important for us to make that distinction between successful, early, and prompt precautionary measures taken at a mass level. And for that kind of mass mobilization to take place, it is important to remember that it was an all-of-government approach. It wasn't simply left to the public health authorities or to the police, but the whole of government was involved. In Korea, for example, the Labor Ministry or the Human Resources Ministry was involved in advising factories and so on how to change the space in factories and offices and so on and so forth to minimize the dangers of picking up infections at the workplace. Mass testing was done in Korea. Vietnam could not afford to do mass testing because the tests are expensive. And so they adopted other types of measures. They did a lot of very effective tracing. And this has been very important. It concerns me, for example, that out of the 16 to 18,000 people who were in the public gathering in Sri Petaling, probably more than 4,000, possibly up to 5,000 people have not even been traced. And we know, for example, that encounter was very, very important in terms of the spread of the virus to places like places such as Brunei, the southern Philippines, and certainly contributed to what had happened in neighboring Singapore and arguably Bangladesh and India as well. So it is very important to have that kind of tracing capacity. But public health authorities are usually not in a good position to do that. So we should have seen other parts of government being deployed accordingly, but we have not seen that kind of involvement and deployment in much of the world, including, unfortunately, our own country, Malaysia. A second important element has been all of society mobilization. You cannot fight this virus simply by diktat, by imposing draconian measures. This is what, for example, India has done, beating up people who cannot get to shelter in time and so on and so forth. That forcing people to do certain things when the police are around is not enough. You need to get people to understand what is going on, to have confidence that what they're doing is contributing to the greater good. And that can only be done through transparency, through developing credibility in the government, and so on and so forth. This is extremely important for us to understand. So having a whole of government approach becomes important. Public education in terms of the challenges posed by COVID-19 becomes extremely important. So all of government involvement, whole of society, and then of course there are other elements which are important in terms of education and so on and so forth. But you cannot have, if you have only part of the government working on COVID-19, and you pose the problem in terms of either lives versus the economy, that is not what is at stake. We have to recognize that life includes livelihoods. And so we have to find some kind of a balance. And that's why the early precautionary measures which were undertaken in East Asia and Kerala were extremely important. But we have to recognize that the advent of COVID-19 has fundamentally changed many things in society. Whether it is early precautionary measures which have required physical distancing and so on and so forth, or we are talking about the lockdowns, which have basically disrupted not only the economic life in a very profound way, but have very much undermined livelihoods. And we have seen that particularly, for example, for the small petty businesses, and also for those who rely very much on daily incomes, daily rated workers, casual laborers, informal laborers, and so on and so forth. The bottom of our society in many instances, they have largely been bypassed, providing them with a little bit of relief. We should recognize that it is relief, not stimulus. It is a relief for them. Is not enough to tide them over for what has essentially been very extended lockdowns in different parts of the world. So I think it is important for us to recognize that there have been a number of major challenges involved in this. So the immediate, whether it is an early action or a lockdown, you have different types of consequences in different economies. And the fact that a lockdown can be terminated after, let us say, 2 weeks, or it can be dragged on for weeks, if not months, has different implications, obviously. It is not for somebody who is renting and paying rent and not earning anything, or for somebody who is relying on credit and paying interest on credit and not able to earn anything in the interim. All those burdens which are normal part of economic life, which people have begun to live with, become extraordinarily burdensome, become very, very disruptive in this kind of a situation. So that's the first kind of situation which we need to talk about, namely different ways in which different societies and authorities have coped with the advent of COVID-19. A second type of situation when we say post-COVID-19 is what happens after usually a lockdown, after a period of intensely dealing with COVID-19. These are in many ways not dissimilar to the situation of early action, the continued requirements of physical distancing, of trying to work increasingly from the home and so on and so forth, and the fact that many people, many of the businesses I referred to earlier will no longer be able to function and many of them will no longer be able to survive. So when we have these alarmist numbers of millions of people becoming unemployed and so on, these are all plausible. These are all plausible, and much depends on how authorities and societies respond to the crisis. It of course depends on the very nature of society. How many people are formally employed? How many people are informally employed? Whether you have contracts for employment or contracts of employment, contracts for labor or contracts of labor. All this defines your rights, and in many ways, the ability of a country, the exchequer, the ability to make relief payments on time and reach the most deserving, these are all very, very much dependent on the nature of specific societies. So I think it is very important for us to recognize that it's not the end of the lockdown period, the end of the MCO in Malaysia, for instance, does not mean that we revert to normal. And of course, for those of us who are able to work from home and so on, it might be less disruptive, and we may be able to carry on pretty much as usual, except for attending webinars like this rather than attending webinars in person, seminars in person. The fact of the matter is that for the vast majority of people, life is not going to go back to business as usual. There is no way that is going to happen even in this intermediate period. And this, I think, is important for us to begin to recognize. Now, in the longer term, and this is the third type of post-COVID-19 possibility. In the longer term, I think it is important to recognize that there are many forces which have already been set in motion, which are almost irreversible. Let me just mention 2 or 3. I think it is very, very likely that the kind of so-called global supply chains which have been promoted by the World Bank and others in the last few decades are going to become much, much shorter. Many economies are going to begin to think about the renationalization, the onshoring rather than the offshoring of production. And what this basically will mean is that those economies such as Bangladesh, such as Malaysia, such as Vietnam, which have been heavily dependent on offshoring of certain production processes, are going to be adversely affected. Jobs are going to be adversely affected, and so on and so forth. So this is going to pose tremendous problems. There is the likelihood of just-in-time delivery systems it is very likely just in time is going to become less of the norm than it has been in the recent past. So we are going to see changes in supply systems. We are also likely to see changes there's going to be a greater inclination, especially in the rich countries, to rely less on people, to rely less on labor. If you have a choice, mechanize. If you can, automate. That is going to be the default option for many businesses going forward. And all this, of course, raises very profound problems of where jobs are going to come from in the future. And of course, many of us have been talking about the possibilities of developing the so-called care economy, care economic services. As societies begin to age, life expectancy increases, and so on and so forth, we need to begin to think of life very, very differently. How is that care economy going to develop? This is going to be a very, very important question which is going to be raised, and many people are going to begin to think about it. But the very nature of the care economy also raises problems, because much of the activity of the care economy actually involves face-to-face contact. And this, of course, poses special problems when you are talking about physical distancing, you're talking about taking enough precautionary measures, and so on and so forth. So the possibilities, while the possibility of developing the care economy becomes more advanced, becomes greater, at the same time, the COVID-19 poses huge problems. I'm of course assuming that we're not going to have a vaccine for some time to come. And I think that's a realistic expectation. True, people are developing trials, and trial periods are going to be shortened because of the exigencies of the moment. But it is very, very likely that we are going to see it's going to take quite some time before the vaccine becomes available, and especially affordable. And part of the problem right now is that there is a scramble for control. Unlike, for example, the polio vaccine, Jonas Salk, or the smallpox vaccine, or any other vaccines, we have seen some of the recent trade agreements are basically trying to extend. If you think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, it sought to extend the realm of intellectual property to cover biologics, to cover naturally occurring substances. And a vaccine usually is a biologic, okay? And so we see that the relationship between law and emerging law and so on and so forth, and how it's going to impact on our life, all these things are going to be challenged and questioned by many people. Now, let me turn quickly, almost by way of conclusion, to focus on 2 or 3 supply chains which I see as being fundamentally going to be rethought and probably going to be changed by COVID-19. First, food. Many economies, at one point in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, Africa was exporting, was a net food exporter. Today, it is a net food importer. Free trade has basically undermined food security and the ability of Africans to produce food for themselves. In fact, many poultry farmers all over the world cannot compete with chicken from the US or Brazil, which is artificially, the prices are kept artificially down through a variety of methods, including the increasing use of antibiotics for animal breeding, and also, of course, the availability of crushed. There's a subsidy for growing maize or corn, and after pressing for the corn oil, the leftover is basically fed to chickens. Now, this basically means that much of African poultry farming, Latin American poultry farming, Caribbean poultry farming, and much of Asian poultry farming has been undermined by this. So we are going to see a number of changes in food supply chains. Much of this, for example, if there's more aquaculture, there's also likely to be much more use of antibiotics, which raises a number of health problems of its own, of health dangers of its own. Jim O'Neill, for example, a very influential writer, has pointed out that he expects about at least 10 million people to die from what is called antimicrobial resistance or resistance to antibiotics. But we are already seeing this. When we need antibiotics, for example, for surgery, emergency surgery, antibiotics may be less effective now because we are consuming antibiotics all the time. Every time we take meat or fish, we are probably consuming some antibiotics. And so our bodies become much less responsive. And then a lot of vegetable growing involves a heavy use of herbicides and other toxic agrochemicals. All this raises huge problems. So are we going to begin to address those problems? Are we going to think about those problems as we rethink food security? In countries like Malaysia, we have been redefining and equating food security with the heavy subsidization of rice farmers, who remain, unfortunately, very, very poor. We should have a broader understanding and appreciation for what food security means. And this, of course, means tremendous things. And we have had the opportunity, for example, to use the school feeding programs to transform small farmer agriculture. But unfortunately, many of these policies, because of the disconnect between different ministries, we have not used those policies to try to improve farming, to try to improve nutrition of populations. So food is one area which is going to be very, very significantly affected. Another area I expect to be very significantly affected is going to be energy. What we have seen, of course, this seems almost counterintuitive to say that there's going to be energy, that we are going to see changes in energy. What we have seen before the recent period, we have seen, for example, in countries like Malaysia, a reversion, by issuing licenses to independent power producers. Instead of making progress towards more renewable energy, we have seen regression. We are producing far more energy today than, say, 30 years ago with coal. And it's not even clean coal. So everybody in the vicinity of a coal plant in Malaysia is basically probably ingesting, breathing in sulfides and sulfites. Sulfides and sulfates, okay, which are both toxic. And this is hugely problematic. But these kinds of policies have become rife because coal continues to be a lower cost fossil fuel, and there has not been enough of a commitment towards moving to renewables. In Europe, for example, from 2006, there was a big push towards biodiesels. Biodiesels are quite expensive in Europe, but that policy is successful. In Malaysia, in Indonesia, we are still, quarreling over 5% or 10% palm oil biodiesel content, and this is very, very sad. I mean, we should be leading the world in terms of moving towards renewables rather than lagging. Malaysia happens to be the largest single exporter to the United States of photovoltaic solar panels. But what do we see? We have seen very little use of solar panels for Malaysian electricity generation, because the incentives are all wrong. So there is a huge opportunity. One might think this is counterintuitive because oil prices are lower than they've ever been for decades. So you might think, oh, prices are so low, why should anybody switch? But I think it is precisely a greater recognition of of our life and in relation to the environment we live in, and our vulnerability to such sources that we are vulnerable to possible energy cutoffs, and this, I think, will cause us a great deal of concern. The third area, I should have mentioned it earlier, but I'll be very brief about this, is medical products, health products, medical products. And again, we have lost huge opportunity here. Some countries, interestingly, India and Bangladesh, a very, very poor country, have actually not only developed pharmaceutical industries, they have been very successful in the case of Bangladesh in exporting some of their pharmaceuticals. In the case of India, they are prohibited under the WTO rules from exporting many of their generic pharmaceuticals. But all this raises a huge the question of what the costs of medicines can be and are. And one would have thought that after some of the recent episodes, for example, the episode involving Martin Shkreli, who was gloating over making a lot of money from increasing the price of the medicine. He bought the patent for a medicine and increased the price from $12.50 to $750. And of course, he claimed that he was putting money into research, except that the books of his company never showed anything like that happening. But one would have expected that people would be outraged by this, and that people would no longer find this acceptable. But there was no reaction. And instead of developing a pharmaceutical industry here, we have basically lost decades, and we've become increasingly reliant on imported pharmaceuticals and the high costs thereof. So these are all supply chains which are going to be quite affected by this. Now we suddenly find ourselves that we can't even get enough masks. That we have to start importing masks. I mean, one of the easiest things to make is something seemingly beyond our ability. and to justify and to induce Malaysians to start producing these masks, there was briefly at least, the price of masks was increased 150% from 80 cents to 2 ringgit. This is something which is, it boggles the mind. But unfortunately, I think we do not have a sensitive enough population which recognizes all these as symptomatic of a system, of an economic system which is already hugely problematic even before COVID-19. But COVID-19 allows us to begin to reflect on quite a number of issues, including sustainability. It forces us to think about inequalities because people are going to be differentially affected by this crisis. They are already being differently affected by this crisis, and about the dysfunctionality of the system itself. So to come back to your original question, I think what we do have now is a very interesting situation where we have the possibility of tremendous learning and, more importantly, of implementing appropriate policies to make this transition. Let us not kid ourselves that we're going to go back to business as usual either later this year or next year or the year after. Business as usual is not only impossible to return to, but also unacceptable. What instead we should be doing is to use this opportunity to recognize that we have a very problematic system, and that we should identify the kinds of transitions which we need to begin to initiate now, to use the opportunity of kicking start the economy now to go forward. Rather than, for example, subsidizing airlines to survive in a situation where there's going to be far less passenger air travel for quite some time to come, we should begin to think about redeploying precious resources to ensure that many of our vulnerabilities are reduced in the longer term. I'm not suggesting autarky. I'm not suggesting that we can solve all the problems which I identified at the outset, but this is an opportunity, and this is where I think we cannot go back to business as usual, and we should be open-minded in terms of thinking of the new normal as something which will be continuously new as we begin to think of new options and new possibilities, and learning from other best practices which are taking place in other societies, and in order that we can all benefit therefrom. So let me stop here. You have been very kind in allowing me to go on for a bit, but I think I've already taxed your indulgence. Let me stop here so that we can have a bit of a discussion around some of the issues your listeners are able to, would like to raise.